What would you do if all you had left in the world were $2 and a memory? What if your only chance at a future meant buying something everyone else had already thrown away? For one young woman in the vast, unforgiving Dakota Territory, that choice would lead to a discovery that would rewrite her destiny and the history of a small, dusty town. But the truth waiting inside a collapsed sod house wasn't one of gold or silver. It was a story of hope, buried under years of dirt and deceit. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. This is a story about the things we choose to see, and the inheritance we earn with our own two hands. Polly Voss arrived in the town of Providence with dust in her throat and an ache in her bones that had nothing to do with the jostling wagon ride. At 22, she was an orphan. The simple wooden cross marking her father's grave outside Bismarck was the last period on the final sentence of her family. All that remained of him, of them, was a heavy, scarred tool chest and the calluses on her own hands. Providence was a splinter of a town driven into the prairie and left to weather. Its single street was a river of dust, its buildings slumped like tired old men. From the moment she stepped down, she felt the town's gaze, indifferent, yet sharp, assessing her worth and finding it wanting. She had $3 and some change to her name, a threadbare dress, and a grief so profound it felt like a second, heavier skeleton inside her own. She took a room at the boarding house, the dollar she paid for it, feeling like a betrayal of her own survival. That night, she lay on the lumpy mattress and listened to the sounds of the town die down, replaced by the vast, empty hum of the plains. She remembered her father, a carpenter whose hands were never still, saying, "They can take anything from you, Polly, your money, your crop, your time. But they can't take the land from under your feet if you own it square." It was his creed, the belief that had carried him west, and the belief that had left him with little more than a plot to be buried in. Yet the words echoed in her now, a final piece of fatherly advice. The next morning, over a meager breakfast she couldn't rightly afford, she heard two cattlemen talking. They laughed about a claim being sold off by the land office for back taxes. Claim 734. One of them snorted. More like the devil's ash pit. Not enough water on that whole quarter section to baptize a flea. The other man chuckled. Some poor fool will buy it though. Always does. Polly listened, her coffee growing cold. A fool's purchase. A place no one wanted. It sounded like a mirror of her own circumstances. It sounded like the only thing in the world she might be able to afford. An idea, desperate and defiant, began to form in her heart. She would not be a laundress or a seamstress, slowly fading in a rented room. She would own something, even if it was just a patch of dirt. She finished her breakfast, left the boarding house, and with her father's tool chest in one hand and her remaining $2 in the other, she walked toward the land office, her stride unsteady, but her purpose as solid as stone. The land office smelled of stale paper, ink, and the faint, bitter scent of shattered dreams. The clerk, a man with a green visor that shadowed his eyes, didn't bother to look up when Polly entered. He was busy tidying a stack of papers, his movements practiced and bored. "Help you?" he asked, his voice flat. Polly placed her father's tool chest on the floor and stepped up to the counter. Her own voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I'd like to purchase a claim," she said. He finally looked at her, his gaze taking in her worn dress and the exhaustion on her young face. A flicker of something, pity or maybe just mild interest, crossed his features before being extinguished. "Which one?" he asked. "Claim 734, she said, the number feeling strange and momentous on her tongue. The clerk's eyebrows lifted. He almost smiled. "That one? Taxes are $2. He said it not as a price, but as a warning. He was giving her a chance to reconsider her foolishness. Polly met his gaze and pushed her last $2 across the worn wooden counter. The sound they made was definitive, final, with a sigh that suggested he'd seen this particular brand of desperation 100 times before. He pulled a large ledger from a shelf, found the entry, and made a notation with a scratchy pen. He took out a deed, dipped the pen again, and wrote her name, Polly Voss, in a looping, indifferent script. He blew on the ink, then took a heavy stamp and slammed it down on the document. The thud echoed in the quiet room. He folded the paper and slid it toward her. "It's yours," he said, his tone making it clear he believed she had just purchased a quarter section of pure trouble. "No water rights, mind you. The soddy on it collapsed a few winters back. Belongs to you now, though, the ruin and the dust." Polly took the deed. The paper was crisp, official. It felt both as heavy as a gravestone and as light as a prayer. She folded it carefully and tucked it into a small pocket inside her dress, the paper resting against her skin. She had done it. She owned land. She was also completely, utterly broke. As she turned to leave, the clerk spoke again, his voice holding that same note of weary cynicism. "Good luck, Miss Voss. You'll need it." She didn't reply. She simply picked up her tool chest and walked out into the blinding Dakota sun. A landowner with nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat. Why would a young woman, orphaned and alone, spend her very last dollar on a piece of land everyone in their right mind had written off as worthless? Was it an act of faith, or one of pure, unadulterated desperation? And what secret, if any, could possibly be hiding beneath the collapsed earth of that forgotten home? Let us know what you think her chances are in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of Polly's incredible journey. Because as she stood there, clutching a deed to a patch of dust, the real story of Claim 734 was just beginning to stir. The sunlight was harsh after the gloom of the land office, and for a moment, Polly had to shield her eyes. When she lowered her hand, a man was standing in her path, blocking her way. He was tall and broad, dressed in a fine wool coat despite the heat. A stark contrast to her own faded calico. His face was florid, his eyes small and shrewd. This was Silas Croft, a man whose name she had already heard, whispered in tones of resentment and fear. He was a speculator, a man who bought and sold land not to work it, but to profit from it. He looked from the land office door to Polly, a slow, contemptuous smile spreading across his face. Well, he boomed, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear, "If it isn't the newest landowner in Providence. I hear you paid a whole $2 for the Dust Bowl." A few men loitering outside the saloon chuckled. Croft gestured vaguely to the west. "I wouldn't graze my sickest cow on that patch, girl. What in God's name do you plan to do with it? Weep on it and hope for a flood?" Polly felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but she held her ground. She looked at his polished boots, then back up to his mocking eyes, and said nothing. Her silence seemed to enrage him more than any retort could have. He saw her father's tool chest at her feet. "Ah, a carpenter, are we?" he sneered. "Planning to build a castle out of dirt clods and regret?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You'll be back in town in a week, begging for work as a laundress. Mark my words." He finally stepped aside, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as if shooing a fly. Polly picked up her chest and walked on, the sound of his laughter following her down the street. She refused to look back. She spent her last few coins on a small sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, and a handful of coffee beans, enough for a few days if she was careful. As she was leaving the general store, her arms full, she passed a small, neat cabin with a porch. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, her face a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and watchful. She had been there when Polly first arrived, a silent observer on the edge of the town's activity. As Polly drew level with the porch, the woman's rocking ceased. Her voice, when it came, was as dry and cracked as the prairie earth. But it carried a strange weight. "Some roots grow in the dark," the woman said, not looking at Polly directly, but out toward the horizon. Polly stopped, uncertain if she was being addressed. The woman continued, her gaze unwavering. You mind the water, child. Not the water you see, but the water you remember. Polly stood there, confused. The words made no sense. Water, you remember? Her claim had no water. That was its fatal flaw. She murmured a polite, "Thank you, ma'am," though she wasn't sure what she was thanking her for. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, and her chair began to rock again, a quiet, rhythmic creak in the afternoon heat. Shaking off this strange encounter, Polly adjusted her grip on her supplies and left the noise and judgment of Providence behind her. She set her face toward the west, toward her plot of land. The laughter of Silas Croft echoed in her memory, but it was the old woman's cryptic words that settled deeper, a peculiar and unsettling stone in the pit of her stomach. The walk was longer than she'd anticipated, the sun a relentless hammer against her back. The road dissolved into a faint wagon track, which in turn faded into the open prairie. The landscape was a monotonous sweep of brown and pale green, the grasses brittle and whispering in the hot wind. There were no trees, no landmarks, just the endless dome of the sky and the curve of the earth. Following the crude map the clerk had drawn for her, she finally saw it as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, a low, dark mound on the prairie, the only interruption in the flatness for miles. This was Claim 734. Her land. Her home. Her heart sank. It was worse than she had imagined. The soddy wasn't just collapsed, it was a ruin. A heap of earth and blackened, rotted timbers melting back into the prairie from which it came. It looked less like a former dwelling and more like an ancient burial mound, a monument to failure. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. Croft was right. The town was right. She was a fool. The sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, the beauty of it feeling like a mockery. The air grew cool. The silence was absolute, a physical presence that pressed in on her. It was a silence unbroken by the lowing of cattle, the crow of a rooster, or the distant sound of a human voice. Out here, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She was too tired to even attempt to explore the ruin. Instead, she found a relatively flat patch of ground a few yards away, sheltered from the wind by the bulk of the collapsed soddy itself. She gathered dried buffalo chips and a few scraps of wood from the wreckage to build a small, cautious fire. The flames were a tiny pinprick of defiant life in the immense, gathering dark. She boiled water for coffee and fried a small piece of salt pork, the smell of it achingly domestic in the vast wilderness. She ate slowly, rationing her hope as much as her food. Afterwards, she unrolled her thin blanket, placing her father's tool chest beside her, its familiar, solid shape a small comfort. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, and stared at the sky. The stars began to appear, not the soft, familiar stars of her childhood, but a brilliant, cold spray of diamonds scattered across black velvet. They looked distant, indifferent. A lone coyote yelped, its call sharp and lonely, and another answered from miles away. The sound amplified her isolation, making her feel like the last person on earth. She clutched the handle of her father's axe, its worn wood a tangible link to a world that no longer existed, and eventually fell into a troubled sleep, the ruin of her new home standing guard over her uneasy dreams. The morning light was pale and unforgiving. It revealed the full extent of the soddy's decay. The thick prairie sod bricks that had formed the walls had slumped and eroded, and the heavy cottonwood beams that once supported the roof lay in a tangled, splintered heap, half buried in dirt and debris. It looked as though a giant had stepped on it. Polly's first thought was that it was unsalvageable. Her second was that she had no other choice. She needed shelter, and this pile of dirt and rot was the only thing she had. After a breakfast of hardtack and black coffee, she set to work. She grabbed the small shovel from her father's chest and began the back-breaking task of clearing the entrance. The work was slow and grueling. Dirt, tangled grass roots, and chunks of sod rained down as she dug. By midday, she had cleared a narrow opening into the dark interior. The air that wafted out was thick with the smell of damp earth, rot, and the faint scent of old ash. Inside, it was a chaotic jumble. More collapsed timbers, remnants of crude furniture crushed beneath the weight of the roof, and a thick layer of dirt covering everything. Her plan was simple and born of necessity. Clear the debris, salvage what timbers she could, and try to create a small, stable space within the ruin where she could be safe from the wind and rain. She started with the largest of the fallen roof beams near the center of the single room. It was heavy, waterlogged, and slick with decay. As she struggled to pry it loose, her gaze fell upon the floor beneath it. Most of the floor was just packed earth, but near what must have been the hearth, a row of heavy, hand-hewn timbers had been laid down as a sort of foundation. One of them caught her eye. It was set at a slight, almost imperceptible angle to the others. And while the rest of the wood was dark and damp, this particular timber seemed drier, its grain a lighter shade of brown. It was a small thing, a detail that didn't quite fit the haphazard construction of the rest of the dwelling. It looked deliberate. For a moment, she paused, her curiosity piqued. But the sun was high, and there was too much work to do. It was probably just a poorly set beam, another sign of the shoddy work that had led to this collapse. She pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to fatigue, and turned her attention back to the heavy, uncooperative roof beam. The anomalous timber could wait. The immediate, crushing reality of her task demanded all of her attention. But as she worked, her mind kept returning to that one piece of wood that refused to lie straight. Days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the slow arc of the sun and the deepening ache in her muscles. Polly's life found a grueling rhythm. Wake at dawn, work until her body screamed for rest, eat a sparse meal by a small fire, and fall into an exhausted sleep. The town of Providence, with its mocking laughter and cynical stares, felt a world away. Out here, there was only the wind, the earth, and the work. She used the tools her father had left her, their familiar weight in her hands a source of quiet strength. The head of the axe, sharpened on a smooth stone, bit into the rotted wood. The shovel became an extension of her arms, moving earth hour after hour. The pry bar gave her leverage against the stubborn weight of the fallen roof. Her hands, once merely calloused, were now cracked and raw, but they were strong. She was slowly, painstakingly, clearing the ruin. She stacked the few salvageable timbers in a neat pile and carted the debris away in buckets, creating a growing mound of earth that looked like a fresh grave beside the old one. Through it all, the thought of the oddly placed floor timber nagged at her. It was a dissonant note in the simple, brutal song of her labor. Finally, one afternoon, when the sun was at its fiercest and she needed a respite from her heavy work, she decided to investigate. She took the pry bar and wedged its tip into the small gap between the strange beam and the one next to it. She put her weight on it. The beam resisted, then shifted with a soft groan. It wasn't nailed down. Encouraged, she worked the pry bar further underneath and heaved with all her might. With a final, sucking sound, the timber lifted free. Polly's heart hammered against her ribs. Beneath it was not more packed earth, but a small, rectangular hollow, no bigger than a bread box. The space had been carefully lined with oilcloth, now yellowed and cracked with age, to protect its contents from the damp. Her hands, trembling slightly from a mixture of effort and anticipation, reached into the cool darkness of the hollow. Her fingers brushed against something hard and cold. Metal. She pulled it out. It was a small tin box, the kind used for tobacco or tea, its surface pitted with rust. It was wedged shut, but after a few minutes of determined prying with the tip of a file, the lid popped open with a sigh of stale air. Inside, carefully folded and miraculously preserved, was a rectangle of canvas. Polly lifted it out. It was heavier than paper, more durable. As she unfolded it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a map, drawn by a steady, meticulous hand. It showed her claim, number 734, clearly marked. But it also showed more. Adjoining her parcel was another, labeled Agnes's Hope, with a small, elegant drawing of a water spring. And beyond that, a third, larger parcel, marked only with a simple cross, and the words, "The Buried Third." The prairie wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't notice. She stared at the map, at the elegant, hopeful script, and the world around her, the desolate ruin, the endless dust, began to transform. This wasn't a deed to a worthless patch of dirt. It was a key. The map was a puzzle. The boundaries were not marked with official survey lines, but with hand-drawn landmarks, the split rock, the tallest cottonwood, the ridge that looks like a sleeping man. These were the markers of someone who knew the land intimately, who read it like a book. But decades of wind and weather could have erased them all. Polly knew she couldn't decipher this alone. She needed someone who understood the language of surveying, the formal grammar that lay beneath this personal poetry. Her mind went immediately to the man she'd heard mentioned in town, John Hanley, the surveyor. He was known to be honest, a quiet man who kept to himself since his wife had passed. He was also, people said, wary of trouble. Presenting him with a mysterious map tied to the town's most worthless piece of land was surely an invitation for it. But she had no other choice. She walked back to Providence the next day, the map tucked safely inside her dress. This time, she didn't feel the town's judgmental stare. Her exhaustion was replaced by a thrumming, nervous energy. She found Hanley's office at the edge of town, a small, orderly cabin that doubled as his home. John Hanley was as they described, a man in his late 30s with sorrow in his eyes, but a firmness in his jaw. He listened to her story with polite skepticism, his expression guarded. He'd seen desperate people cling to impossible hopes before. But when she carefully unfolded the canvas map on his drafting table, his demeanor shifted. He leaned in, his professional curiosity overriding his caution. "This is Thorne's work," he murmured, tracing a line with his finger. "Elias Thorne. He was the territorial surveyor here, 30 years ago. An eccentric old fellow, meticulous, honest to a fault." He began to study the annotations, his brow furrowed in concentration. Piece by piece, he unlocked the map's secrets. The second parcel, Agnes's Hope, was a water claim, filed under the name of Agnes Thorne, Elias's wife. It had been abandoned decades ago, likely after the spring Elias had discovered either dried up or was deliberately hidden. Agnes's Hope, Polly whispered, the name feeling sacred on her lips. It wasn't just a label. It was a prayer from a husband for his wife. She felt a sudden, fierce kinship with this woman she'd never met, another woman who had placed her hopes in this hard land. Hanley then turned his attention to the third parcel, the one marked with a cross. His expression grew grim. He cross-referenced the map with his own official charts. "Polly," he said, his voice low and serious, "this is a mineral claim. It's part of the old Red Creek grant. There was a scandal before statehood. A group of investors, including Silas Croft's father, used fraudulent paperwork to seize a huge tract of land from the original homesteaders. Thorne was the surveyor who exposed it. He was run out of the territory for his trouble." He looked from the map to Polly. "This map? This isn't just a map. It's Thorne's evidence. He must have hidden the true deed to this third parcel, and this is how he intended to find it again." The truth settled over Polly, vast and terrifying. Her $2 claim wasn't a random piece of forgotten land. It was the hiding place for a story of justice and fraud, a legacy of defiance left by an honest man. John Hanley's voice cut through her thoughts, sharp with warning. "If this is what I think it is, Polly, and if Croft gets wind of it, he will do anything to stop you from proving these claims are yours." Polly looked down at her calloused hands, then at the map. It was more than land now. It was a debt to the past. "It's my land," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I have to prove it." The first step was to find the spring. According to Thorne's map, it should be located in a shallow ravine on the adjoining parcel, hidden by what he had cryptically labeled a deliberate fall of stone. With John Hanley guiding them, they rode out from town, leaving the track and heading into the rolling prairie that Silas Croft used for open-range grazing. Hanley, carrying his transit and ranging rods, was all business, but Polly could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. They found the ravine easily enough, a gentle depression carved by ancient water, and at its head they found a large, jumbled pile of rocks and boulders, looking for all the world like a natural rock slide. But as Hanley examined it, he pointed. "See there?" he said, indicating a large, flat stone wedged at the base. "And there, the way those smaller rocks are chinked in? This wasn't a slide. This was built." Thorn blocked his own spring to hide it. They set to work with pry bars and raw strength, levering the smaller rocks out of the way. It was slow, arduous labor. As they paused to catch their breath, the sound of hoofbeats made them both freeze. 3 riders crested the nearby rise, silhouetted against the bright sky. At their lead was Silas Croft. His eyes, small and hard, took in the scene: Polly, John Hanley, the surveying equipment, and their work on the rock pile. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face as he rode down toward them, his men fanning out behind him. "Well now, Hanley, I didn't take you for a treasure hunter," he called out, his voice dripping with menace. "And Miss Voss, you seem to be trespassing. This is my grazing land." Polly's heart pounded. "We're on the parcel adjoining my claim," she stated, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're looking for a survey marker." Croft's eyes narrowed, fixing on the canvas map that Polly was clutching in her hand. "What's that you've got there? Some kind of pirate map?" he sneered, nudging his horse closer. "Give it here." John Hanley stepped calmly between Croft and Polly. "She has a legal right to survey the boundaries of her property. Croft, you know that." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the dry grass. Croft was bigger, and he had 2 men with him who looked like they were comfortable with violence. It was his word against theirs. He could take the map, destroy it, and no one would ever be the wiser. Polly felt a wave of terror, but beneath it was a bedrock of pure, cold anger. She thought of Elias and Agnes Thorne, of their stolen hope. She would not let this man erase them. Just as Croft opened his mouth to give an order, a dark patch appeared on the dusty ground near the rock they had just moved. A trickle of water, black with ancient mud, seeped from beneath the stones. Then another. A small, steady flow began to emerge, the sound of it a miracle in the silence. Croft's gaze snapped to the water, his mask of contempt momentarily dropping to reveal raw, naked greed. He knew exactly what a hidden spring was worth in this dry country. He shot Polly a look of pure hatred, then wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he spat, before riding off, his men following close behind. The threat hung in the air, but as Polly and John watched them go, the sound of the growing stream was a promise of life, a victory won. The discovery of the spring changed everything. John Hanley helped Polly file the paperwork at the land office to assume the abandoned water claim of Agnes Thorne. The clerk, the same man who had sold her the worthless deed, now looked at her with a dazed mixture of shock and respect. The news spread through Providence like a grass fire. The girl who'd bought the dust bowl had found water. The whispers that followed Polly were no longer mocking. They were filled with awe and envy. People who had ignored her now tipped their hats. But the spring was only the beginning. The real prize was the buried third, the mineral claim that Elias Thorne had tried to protect from Croft's family. Armed with the water rights, which gave them legal access to the adjoining land, Polly and John set out to find Thorne's final markers. The map led them to a gnarled, ancient cottonwood near a dry creek bed. There, half swallowed by bark, was the blaze mark Thorne had carved decades earlier. Miles from there, on a rocky outcrop, they found the last marker, an iron survey rod driven deep into a fissure in the stone, exactly where the map's cross was drawn. It was all there. The proof was irrefutable. John spent a week drafting a meticulous new survey and a legal affidavit, detailing the history of the claims, the discovery of the map, and the rediscovery of Thorne's original markers. He compiled old territorial records that documented the Red Creek land fraud and Elias Thorne's role in exposing it. It was a masterful piece of legal and historical detective work. They presented the entire case to the visiting federal land marshal, a stern, impartial man sent by the territorial government. Silas Croft, as expected, arrived with a lawyer from Bismarck, blustering about his family's long-held grazing rights and dismissing Polly's claim as a fantasy built on a fraudulent map. But his arguments crumbled under the weight of John Hanley's evidence. The map, the spring, the iron rod, they told a story that was too coherent, too powerful to deny. The marshal listened to both sides without expression, then delivered his judgment. The original Thorne deeds, having never been legally voided, took precedence. The land belonged to Polly Voss. Croft was not ruined or arrested. The original fraud was too old, the lines of culpability too blurred by time. But he was profoundly, publicly humbled. His power, built on bluster and intimidation, had been checked by a broke orphan girl with a $2 deed and an old map. The town's transformation was complete. They no longer saw her as a fool, but as a founder. The area began to be known not as the Dust Bowl, but as Voss Springs. One afternoon, a family of homesteaders, their wagon axle broken, limped to her property. Polly gave them water from her spring, shared her food, and offered the husband the use of her father's tools to make the repair. They stayed for 2 days, sheltered in the small but sturdy soddy she had rebuilt with her own hands. When they left, they spread the story of her quiet generosity to every person they met. The laughter of the town had turned to reverence. Months had passed. The fierce heat of summer had softened into the golden melancholy of autumn. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, warm shadows across the valley that was now hers. Polly stood on a small rise, looking out at what she had made. The soddy was no longer a ruin, but a home, small and solid, with a plume of wood smoke curling from its new stone chimney. Near the spring, which now pooled into a clear, tranquil pond fringed with cattails, a small vegetable garden had yielded a modest harvest. Her father's axe, its blade clean and sharp, leaned against the doorframe, its work done for the day. The land was no longer silent. It was filled with the gentle sounds of her own life. The lowing of the single milk cow she had bought. The rustle of wind in the tall grass. The murmur of the spring. She heard a horse approaching and turned to see John Hanley riding up the gentle slope. He was no longer just a surveyor, but a friend, a partner in this unlikely venture. He reined in his horse and looked around, his gaze taking in the house, the pond, the neat stacks of firewood. A slow, genuine smile touched his face. "You did it, Polly," he said, his voice filled with a quiet admiration. "You have a real home here." Polly looked out at the rolling land before her, the 3 parcels, once separate and lost, now joined together as one. The worthless dust patch, the hidden spring, the buried field. It was all hers, earned not by money or by birthright, but by labor and belief. "My father always said land is the only thing that lasts," she said, her voice soft in the evening air. She turned to look at John, the golden light catching in her hair. "He was wrong," she continued. "It's what you build on it that does." They stood together in the fading light, in a comfortable and easy silence, watching the last colors of the day paint the vast Dakota sky. She hadn't just found a home, she had built one, not just from sod and timber, but from the forgotten hopes of others, and the strength she had discovered deep within herself. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It's a powerful reminder that true inheritance isn't what we're given, but what we have the heart to claim. If you were moved by Polly's journey, please leave a like and a comment below, and subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. We'll see you next time. What would you do if you had nothing left but the clothes on your back and $4 to your name? What if the only thing you could afford was a place the rest of the world had agreed to forget? A place sealed and silent for a decade? For Ida Whitcomb, a 25-year-old laundrywoman in the raw, dust-choked heart of 1880s California, this wasn't a question. It was the hard reality of a Tuesday afternoon. She bought a locked Chinese temple for $4, a place rumored to hold nothing but fever and ghosts. The only property at the county auction no one would even look at. But the truth waiting inside those sealed doors had little to do with sickness and everything to do with the silence the town had paid dearly to keep. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, song as we tell a story about the things we throw away and the secrets they keep. Ida stood at the back of the small crowd gathered in front of the livery stable. The auctioneer's voice was a practiced drone, selling off parcels of land, unclaimed freight, and the paltry belongings of people who had either died or disappeared. She kept her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn apron, the fabric thin and smelling faintly of lye soap and sunshine, the last remnants of a life that had ended that morning. Her employer, Mrs. Gable, had told her plainly, "Times are hard, Ida. I can't afford the help." There was no malice in it, just the flat, unpitying truth of their world. So Ida had packed her few things in a flour sack, collected her final wages, and walked away from the only home she'd known for 3 years. Though the $4 silver in her pocket felt both impossibly heavy and terrifyingly light. She had watched as a good horse sold for $60, a barren quarter-acre for $20, a set of carpenter's tools for $8. Everything was beyond her. She was just waiting, she supposed, for the auction to end so the crowd would disperse and she could find a corner to be alone with the rising panic in her chest. Then the auctioneer, a man named Henderson with a stained vest and a booming voice, cleared his throat. "All right, last lot of the day. Property at the east edge of town, known as the Old Joss House, deed number 734. A murmur went through the crowd, a rustle of discomfort. Men shuffled their feet. Women pulled their shawls a little tighter. No one stepped forward. Ida looked toward the east, where the road dissolved into dry plains. She knew the building. A strange, tiered roof and faded paint, visible from the edge of town like a forgotten monument. "It's been sealed 10 years, Henderson continued, his voice losing some of its bluster. "Sold as is, where is. County takes no responsibility for its contents or condition. Do I have an opening bid? Let's say $10? Silence. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust that danced between the unmoving boots of the ranchers and merchants. $5? Henderson asked, a note of pleading in his tone. He looked around, meeting no one's eye. The property was a dead weight on the county books, a place everyone wanted gone but no one would touch. A memory of her father's voice, a low rumble from a long time ago, surfaced in her mind. There's no such thing as worthless, Ida, and just things folks ain't got the patience to understand. $1, a man near the front snickered, and a few others laughed with him. It was a joke. Henderson's face tightened. This is a legal auction, gentlemen. He scanned the crowd one last time, his gaze passing over Ida without seeing her. She felt a strange impulse, a pull not of logic, but of desperation. She had $4. If she spent them, she would have nothing, but she already had nothing. What she didn't have was a roof for the night. This place, whatever it was, had one. She took a breath, the dust sharp in her throat. $4, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the thick silence it carried like a shout. Every head turned. The laughter died. People stared at her. The laundry girl, the one Mrs. Gable let go. They saw her plain dress, her tired face, and the absurdity of her bid. Henderson blinked, genuinely surprised. $4 from the young lady in the back? Do I hear 5? He didn't wait long. He knew there would be no other bids. Going once, going twice. Sold. The gavel fell with a crack that felt like the breaking of a spell. To Miss Ida Whitcomb for $4. The crowd began to break apart, their whispers following her as she walked forward, a low hiss of pity and suspicion. Fever house. Bad luck. What's a woman like her want with a place like that? She ignored them, her face a calm mask, and handed her $4 to the clerk. In return, he gave her a folded deed and a single, heavy iron key, its surface pitted with rust. The key was cold in her palm, a piece of dead, unyielding metal. It was the key to a place no one wanted, so it's a place of secrets and sorrow. It was the only thing in the world she owned. The walk to the edge of town was short, but it felt like a pilgrimage. With each step, the sounds of Prosperity Wells, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of wagons, the distant shouts of children, faded behind her, replaced by the low moan of the wind across the open plain. The temple stood on a slight rise, set back from the road as if it had tried to retreat from the town that had forsaken it. The setting sun bled across the sky, casting the building in hues of bruised purple and soft, melancholic orange. It was larger than she had remembered, with a swooping, tiered roofline that seemed more suited to a storybook than to the hardscrabble landscape of California. The paint, once a vibrant red and gold, had been scoured by a decade of sun and wind, leaving behind a pale, ghostly shell. Weeds choked the small yard, and a single, skeletal tree clawed at the sky beside it. The front doors were massive, made of thick, dark wood, and barred shut with heavy planks of timber nailed across them. A paper talisman, its calligraphy faded to an illegible gray smudge, was tacked to the center, fluttering weakly in the breeze. It was a place that didn't just feel abandoned, it felt imprisoned. The town's fear was a physical presence here, a palpable weight in the air. Ida clutched the deed in her hand, the paper a flimsy proof of ownership against the building's profound and sorrowful silence. She had bought a building, but it felt more like she had acquired a tombstone. It looked exactly as worthless as the $4 she'd paid for it. Her heart, which had been buoyed by the strange, defiant act of the purchase, now sank with the sun. This was a mistake, a fool's purchase made by a desperate woman. What had she been thinking? The whispers of the townspeople returned to her. Fever house. They said a terrible sickness had swept through the Chinese community that had built it, leaving no one alive. The county marshal, they said, had sealed it himself to keep the contagion from spreading. It was a clean, simple story. A tragedy, but one that was safely in the past. Ida stood before the barred doors, the heavy iron key useless in her pocket, and felt the full weight of her isolation settle upon her. She had traded all she had for a pile of decaying wood and bad memories. Was this the end of Ida's road, or just the beginning? What secret was so terrible it had to be nailed shut behind these doors? Let us know what you think she'll find inside, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. Now, as the last light faded, Ida had to face her first night as a property owner, with nothing but a locked door between her and the unknown. The mockery began before she had even left the auction. It was a low tide of whispers and sideways glances, but it found its high water mark in Silas Croft. Croft was a man who had prospered in Prosperity Wells. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, held the note on the general store, and had a voice that was accustomed to filling any room he entered. He found her as she was counting the few coins she had left, trying to decide between a loaf of bread or a sack of oats. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a blanket. "Well, well," he boomed, a wide, just unkind smile spreading across his face. "If it ain't the newest land baron in the county." A few men loitering on the boardwalk chuckled. "I hear you bought yourself a temple, missy." Ida said nothing, merely looking up at him, her expression unreadable. $4, Croft laughed. a loud, braying sound. I'd have paid you $4 to haul it away. You know what's in there, don't you? The ghost of every sick Chinaman that died in this valley. You bought yourself a plague house. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. Take some advice. Use that deed for kindling and walk away. Some doors are best left shut. He straightened up, satisfied, and walked away, his laughter echoing down the street. The silence he left behind was just as loud. Later, inside the general store, a different kind of warning came. As she paid for a small sack of flour and a box of matches, the proprietor, Mr. Finch, avoided her eyes. But from the back of the store, where he was sweeping, an old Chinese man watched her. He was frail, his back bent into a permanent question mark, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He had been in the valley as long as anyone could remember, a quiet fixture who unloaded freight and did odd jobs, speaking only when necessary. As Ida turned to leave, he stepped forward, his broom held still in his gnarled hands. He glanced at the deed peeking out from her sack. They say fever, he said, his voice a dry whisper like rustling leaves. Fever is quick, convenient. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers. Some ghosts are not spirits. They are debts. Before Ida could ask what he meant, he bowed his head slightly and retreated into the shadows of the storeroom. The words settled in her mind, strange and unsettling. Debts, not sickness. The final warning came from Albert Pike. He was a railroad surveyor, a quiet man with kind eyes and a face weathered by the sun. She had seen him around town, but they had never spoken. He found her sitting on a bench, staring at the useless key in her hand. He didn't mock her. He sat at the other end of the bench, as if giving her space. That was a brave thing you did, he said softly. Ida looked up, surprised. It was a foolish thing, she replied, her voice barely audible. Maybe, he conceded. Or maybe not. I just wanted to say, be careful. He looked out toward the east, in the direction of the temple. I've been surveying the lines out that way for the past year. I've seen that place 100 times. I've also seen the records back at the county office. He lowered his voice. The official story is fever, but the timeline doesn't make sense. The railroad had just laid a new spur line. There was a dispute over labor, over pay. Then suddenly, the whole Chinese camp is empty, and the temple is sealed. The dispute was gone, too. He looked at her directly. Croft was the foreman for that railroad crew. He got his land cheap right after. He stood up. The story about a fever is easier than the one about a fight. Just be careful what you go looking for. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ida alone with 3 warnings, each one darker and more complex than the last. The key in her hand no longer felt just cold. It felt dangerous. That evening, as twilight settled, Ida made her way to the temple. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and dry grass. She carried her meager possessions in the flour sack slung over her shoulder. The sack of flour, the matches, a tin cup, and a threadbare blanket. The temple loomed before her, a dark shape against a sky full of stars. The heavy timber planks barring the doors were formidable, held in place by thick, hand-forged spikes that looked like they had been driven in with a sledgehammer. The rust-pitted key the auctioneer had given her was for the lock, but the lock was hidden behind the barricade. There would be no getting inside tonight. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it made her knees feel weak. She had nowhere else to go. This was her property, her shelter, even if she was on the wrong side of its walls. She walked around the building, her boots crunching on the dry, overgrown weeds. The side windows were boarded over just as securely as the front doors. At the back, a small, collapsed lean-to sagged against the wall, its roof a tangle of broken boards. There was no way in. Defeated, she returned to the front and sank down onto the wide porch steps. The wood was old and silvered, but it felt solid beneath her. She pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders, the fabric doing little to ward off the chill that was seeping up from the ground. The silence was absolute. Out here, there were no town sounds, only the vast, indifferent quiet of the plains. She was utterly alone. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, then another. She didn't bother to wipe them away. What was the point? She had been so proud, she so defiant at the auction. Now, sitting in the dark in front of a building that was sealed like a coffin, she just felt like a fool. As she huddled there, a movement in the shadows caught her eye. Two yellow eyes blinked at her from the edge of the overgrown yard. A low growl rumbled in the dark. Ida froze, her heart pounding. A wolf? A coyote? The shape detached itself from the darkness and padded silently closer. It was a dog. A scruffy, medium-sized stray with matted fur and ribs showing plainly through its hide. It stopped a few feet away, head low, tail giving a tentative, uncertain wag. It looked as lost and lonely as she felt. She stayed perfectly still. The dog watched her for a long moment, then circled once and lay down at the other end of the porch, letting out a heavy sigh, as if it, too, had come to the end of a long and difficult road. Ida watched the slow rise and fall of its flank. She wasn't alone anymore. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of the wind whispering around the eaves of the temple, a sound like a long, drawn-out secret. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was the heavy, dreamless sleep of the utterly spent. The first light of dawn was a thin gray line on the horizon when Ida woke. She was stiff and cold, the blanket damp with dew. The stray dog was still there, sleeping at the far end of the porch, a dusty, motionless lump. It lifted its head as she sat up, watching her with weary intelligence. She had nothing to offer it, but its presence was a small comfort against the morning's vast emptiness. Her first task was the door. The iron key was useless as long as the planks were in place. She needed a pry bar, a crowbar, something with leverage. She had nothing. She walked the perimeter of the property, her eyes scanning the ground, hoping to find a discarded tool, a piece of metal, anything. All she found were weeds, rocks, and the detritus of a decade of neglect. As the sun climbed higher, casting a flat, unforgiving light on her predicament, she heard the rhythmic clopping of a horse. It was Albert Pike, riding out for his day's work surveying. He reined in his horse when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Whitcomb," he said, tipping his hat. "Looks like you have a bit of a predicament." Ida nodded, a faint blush of embarrassment on her cheeks. "The doors are nailed shut." "I see that," he said. He looked at the thick spikes, then back at her. "It'll take more than bare hands to get through those." He swung down from his horse. From a leather roll tied behind his saddle, he produced a long, heavy crowbar. "Let's see what we can do." He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply saw a problem and offered a solution. Together, they worked on the planks. The wood was old pine, and the spikes were sunk deep. Albert wedged the tip of the crowbar under the first plank and put his weight into it. The wood groaned in protest. Ida used a heavy rock to hammer the crowbar deeper. It was slow, arduous work. The screech of the nails pulling free was a piercing, ugly sound. With each one, Ida felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. She was breaking a seal, violating a warning. After nearly an hour of straining and sweating under the morning sun, the last plank came free with a loud crack and clattered onto the porch. Behind it was the door and the heavy, ornate iron lock. Albert tried the handle. It was frozen solid with rust. "Key won't work on that," he said, wiping his brow. "It's seized." He hefted the crowbar again. Permission to break your lock, ma'am? Ida hesitated for only a second. Yes. He positioned the crowbar, and with two sharp, powerful blows, the iron housing of the lock shattered. The great door swung inward with a low groan, opening a rectangle of profound darkness. The air that billowed out was thick and stale, smelling of dust, decaying paper, and something else. Something faintly medicinal, like dried herbs. Albert stepped back. "My work is done," he said. "The rest is yours." He refused her offer of thanks, to simply nodding before mounting his horse and riding off. Ida stood at the threshold, peering into the gloom. She lit one of her precious matches. The flame flickered, then steadied, pushing back the darkness in a small, trembling circle. The interior was vast. Dust lay like a soft gray blanket over everything. Benches, a large central altar, intricate wooden carvings on the walls. But through the dust, she saw not chaos, but order. Cushions were neatly stacked on the benches. Scrolls were tidied away in alcoves. It did not look like a place abandoned in a panic. She stepped inside, the stray dog following at her heels. Her lantern cast dancing shadows. She ran a hand over the altar, a wide, flat table of dark, polished wood. And there she saw it, the first clue. In the thick, undisturbed layer of dust that covered the entire surface, there was a single, perfect circle, about the size of a teacup, a clean spot. The wood inside the circle was dark and clear, as if an object had been resting there for 10 years and had only recently been lifted away. But that was impossible. No one had been inside. The doors had been sealed. She touched the clean spot. The wood felt cool. It was a detail that didn't fit, a note of dissonance in the silent, dusty room. Something was wrong with the story. Ida spent the rest of that day letting the light and air into the temple. She and Albert had broken the seal on the front doors, but the windows were still boarded tight. Lacking a crowbar of her own, she used the claw end of a broken hammer she found in the collapsed lean-to, working patiently at the nails on one of the large side windows. The boards came away with the same groaning reluctance as the ones on the door, and when the last one fell, sunlight streamed into the dusty space, cutting golden shafts through the gloom. For the first time, she could truly see what she had bought. The room was long and high-ceilinged. Intricate, unpainted wooden carvings of dragons and birds decorated the beams. Along the walls were long benches, and at the far end stood the altar she had seen by lantern light. It was a place of worship, that was clear, but it felt like more. There were shelves filled with clay jars and paper-wrapped parcels, and alcoves that held not icons, but books and scrolls. It felt like a library, a school, a community hall, all in one. It felt lived in, even under its decade-thick shroud of dust. She found a broom with a worn but still functional one head and began to sweep. The work was simple, physical, and deeply satisfying. With each stroke, she was not just clearing away dirt, she was peeling back time. The stray dog, whom she had decided to call Dust, lay in a patch of sun near the open door, watching her with half-closed eyes. He seemed to have appointed himself the guardian of the threshold, a silent, furry companion to her solitary labor. As she swept, her mind turned over the clean circle on the altar. It was a persistent, nagging anomaly. How could a spot be clean when everything around it was buried in dust? Had someone been inside? If so, how and why? It suggested a recent presence, a secret visitor. Her work uncovered more inconsistencies. Near the back wall, she found a stack of neatly folded blankets, clean and ready for use, stored inside a wooden chest. But in another corner, she uncovered crates filled with dried herbs, roots, and bottled tinctures, all meticulously labeled in both English and Chinese characters. These weren't the belongings of people fleeing a plague. These were the well-managed stores of a clinic or an apothecary. This place hadn't just been a temple, it had been a place of healing. The town's story of a fever now seemed even more hollow. If there had been a terrible sickness, wouldn't these medicines have been used, scattered, depleted? Instead, they were packed away, as if in preparation for a long winter. The image of a community preparing for a siege began to form in her mind, replacing the one of panicked victims. This was a place that had been getting ready for something, not running from it. The labor was hard on her body, which was accustomed to the repetitive motions of laundry, not the heavy work of hauling and scrubbing. By late afternoon, her back ached and her hands were raw. She stopped to rest, sitting on one of the benches she had cleared. Dust patted over and rested his head on her knee, a gesture of simple, uncomplicated fellowship. She stroked his matted fur, her gaze sweeping over the slowly transforming room. The sun, now slanting low through the newly opened window, illuminated a row of small, worn shoes tucked neatly under another bench. Children's shoes. The sight sent a pang through her chest. They weren't tossed aside. They were placed there carefully, side by side, as if their owners intended to come right back for them. The temple was full of these small, quiet testaments to an orderly life, interrupted. She went back to her work, a new sense of purpose driving her. She was no longer just cleaning a derelict building. She was bearing witness. As she swept around the main altar, her broom snagged on something. She bent down to look. One of the wide floorboards right at the foot of the altar was slightly raised along one edge. It wasn't much, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to catch the bristles of the broom. She tried to press it down with her foot, but it was solid. Curious, she knelt, her fingers tracing the edge. It felt loose. She worked her fingertips into the crack and pulled. The board resisted, then shifted with a low groan. Ida's heart began to beat a little faster. The loose floorboard felt like a secret wanting to be told. She set the broom aside and knelt on the dusty floor, her fingers probing the edges of the plank. It was cut differently from the others, the seams more deliberate. Using the broken hammer's claw, she wedged it into the crack and gently pried. The wood groaned, but it gave way. With a final pull, the board came up in her hands, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. The space wasn't just a gap between joists. It had been intentionally hollowed out and lined with thick black oilcloth to keep out the damp. And nestled inside, fitting the space perfectly, was a metal box. It was a simple cash box, the kind a merchant might use, about the size of a loaf of bread, its black paint chipped and worn. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Treasure. The thought was immediate and overwhelming. Had she stumbled upon the hidden savings of the temple's builders? A fortune sealed away from the world? Her hands trembled as she reached into the dark space and lifted the box out. It was heavy, solid. She expected it to be locked, to present another barrier, another challenge. But when she tested the latch, it clicked open easily. It hadn't been locked at all. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dry ink, and slowly lifted the lid. There was no glint of gold, no hoard of silver coins. The box was filled with paper. It was packed with thin, leather-bound ledgers and stacks of receipts tied with string. A profound disappointment washed over her, sharp and bitter. It was just paperwork, worthless. She almost closed the lid, her grand discovery dissolving into nothing more than a pile of old accounts. But the words of the old Chinese man echoed in her mind. Some ghosts are not spirits. They are debts. She picked up the topmost ledger. It was written in a neat, careful hand, the columns precise. The entries were in a mix of English and Chinese characters. She could read the English parts. Silas Croft, 200 feet lumber, $16, unpaid. Miller's livery. Hire of 2 wagons, $5, unpaid. Prosperity General Store, 5 sacks rice, paid. On and on it went, a meticulous record of the economic life of the Chinese community. It was a ledger of debts, both paid and, more often, unpaid. She leafed through page after page, recognizing the names of the most prominent men in Prosperity Wells. Croft's name appeared most frequently, his debts the largest. This wasn't just an account book. It was a shadow history of the town, written from the perspective of the people everyone else had tried to forget. Tucked in the very bottom of the box, each wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth, was one last book. It was smaller than the others, a personal journal. The script was the same, but the tone was different. The first entries were hopeful, describing the building of the temple, the birth of children, the planting of a garden. But as the pages turned, the entries grew darker. They described threats from railroad foremen, disputes over wages, small acts of violence that went unpunished. The last entry was dated 10 years ago in the fall. The ink was slightly blurred, the handwriting rushed. They are coming. Croft's men, with torches. They say it is fever to scare the town. It is not fever. It is a clearing of accounts. We have hidden the books. We have hidden the children in the cellar beneath the kitchen. May Kuan Yin forgive us and protect them. A cold dread washed over Ida, and it wasn't a massacre. It was an execution. An act of violent, calculated greed disguised as a public health crisis. She now understood the nailed doors, the convenient story, Croft's pointed warnings. The temple wasn't a tomb for the dead. It was a vault for the evidence. And she had just opened it. The sky, which had been a clear, bright blue all day, began to bruise with gray clouds by late afternoon. A cool, damp wind swept in from the east, rattling the newly uncovered window panes and carrying the scent of rain. The journal lay open on Ida's lap, its final, terrible words seeming to burn in the fading light. A cellar beneath the kitchen. The collapsed lean-to at the back must have been the kitchen. She had to see. She grabbed her lantern and hurried out the back, dust trotting anxiously at her heels. The lean-to was a wreck. The roof caved in. The walls splintered. But under the debris, she could make out the shape of a large iron stove and a stone hearth. The floor was a mess of broken boards and packed earth. She began to clear a space, her hands raw, her mind racing. Where would a cellar door be? After 10 minutes of frantic searching, she found it. A thick iron ring, almost completely buried in the dirt. She dug around it with her fingers and pulled with all her might. It was impossibly heavy. As she struggled, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the temple. The storm was coming fast. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a shout over the wind. "Hello? Anybody there?" A man's voice, strained with panic. Ida looked up to see a wagon on the road, its one wheel splintered and sunk deep into the mud that was quickly forming. A man, a woman, and 2 small children were huddled beside it, exposed to the driving rain. They were strangers, travelers caught by the sudden storm. Ida didn't hesitate. Her own desperate search could wait. "In here!" she yelled, waving them toward the temple. "Hurry!" They scrambled toward the shelter of the porch, the man carrying the younger child, the woman guiding the other. They were soaked and shivering. "Our axle broke," the man said, his teeth chattering. "We saw your light." "Come inside," Ida said, leading them into the dry, cavernous space of the temple. The woman looked around, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "What is this place?" she asked. "It's a shelter," Ida replied simply. She led them to the corner where she had found the clean blankets, handing them out. She used some of the splintered boards from the lean-to build a small, cautious fire in the stone hearth at the back, the smoke finding its way out through a crack in the roof. The small flame pushed back the damp and the dark, creating a small island of warmth and light. The family's little girl had a racking cough. Remembering the crates of medicine, Ida found a jar of honey and licorice root tincture. She mixed a spoonful with warm water in her tin cup and gave it to the child, who drank it gratefully. The family looked at her with awe. They were strangers, and she, a stranger herself, had given them warmth, shelter, and medicine. As the storm raged outside, a different kind of threat appeared. A horseman rode up to the temple, a dark figure against the lightning-streaked sky. It was Silas Croft. He dismounted and strode onto the porch, his face a mask of thunder. "What do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, his voice carrying over the storm. He saw the family huddled by the fire, the light in the window. "I told you to leave this place be. I told you it was cursed." Ida rose and walked to the open doorway, positioning herself between him and the family she was protecting. She was trembling, but she stood her ground. "It's raining," she said, her voice quiet but firm. They needed shelter. Croft's eyes narrowed, searching her face in the flickering lantern light. He was looking for fear, for compliance. He saw none. He saw a woman who had drawn a line in the dirt. He saw the open ledgers on the bench behind her. His face went pale. "You are making a terrible mistake," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He pointed a finger at her. "There are things buried here that need to stay buried." He held her gaze for a long, charged moment, then turned without another word, mounted his horse, and galloped away into the storm. Ida stayed in the doorway until he was gone, her heart pounding like a drum. The choice had been made for her. She was no longer just a caretaker of a building. She was the guardian of its truth. The storm broke before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The family, whose name was Miller, was full of gratitude. The father, a blacksmith by trade, insisted on helping Ida with the cellar door before they left. His strength, combined with hers, was enough. The heavy wooden door lifted, revealing a set of steep stone steps leading down into darkness. "Thank you," Ida said, her voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Miller pressed a small carved bird into her hand. "No," she said softly. "Thank you. You gave us sanctuary." As they rigged a repair for their wagon and prepared to limp on to the next town, they promised to tell everyone of the kindness they had found in the old temple. When they were gone, Ida lit her lantern and descended the steps. The air in the cellar was cool and dry. It was small, no more than 10 feet square with stone walls. In the center of the room were several small cots, and on them neatly folded blankets. It was a hiding place, but it was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no forgotten belongings. A wave of relief and sorrow washed over her. The children had been hidden here, but they hadn't been found here. What had become of them? Had they escaped? Tucked into a crevice between two stones in the wall, she found one last thing: a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were several dozen letters, written in Chinese, and a single daguerreotype. It was a portrait of a smiling man and woman, surrounded by a group of about 15 people, including several children, standing proudly in front of the newly built temple. It was the face of the community that had been erased. Ida knew she couldn't keep this discovery to herself. The ledgers, the journal, the letters, they were too important. The next morning, she wrapped the books and the photograph carefully in oilcloth and walked into town. She went straight to the county surveyor's office, a small, dusty room filled with maps and charts. Albert Pike was there, poring over a topographical survey. He looked up as she entered. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, a question in his eyes. Without a word, She unwrapped the bundle and laid the ledgers on his desk. She opened the journal to the last, terrible entry. He read it, his face growing grim. He picked up the ledgers, his surveyor's eye for detail recognizing the meticulous nature of the records. These are proof, he murmured, looking from the books to her face. Croft's warning, Ida said. It wasn't about a curse. No, Albert replied, his voice low. It was a threat. Together they went to the county courthouse to see the clerk, a small, balding man named Mr. Abernathy, who had a reputation for being quiet and scrupulously honest. He listened to their story patiently, his fingers steepled under his chin. He examined the ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration. He recognized the names. He recognized the debts. He cross-referenced one of Croft's unpaid entries with a deed transfer record from the same year. The debt for the lumber, Abernathy said softly, was for the construction of Croft's first barn. According to this, he acquired the land for that barn 1 week after the temple was officially sealed. The previous owner was a Mr. Chen. He looked up, his mild eyes now hard as stone. This isn't just a journal, Miss Whitcomb. This is corroborating evidence. Word began to spread, not like a wildfire, but like a slow seeping water. It started with the Millers, who told the story of the kind woman in the old Joss house who gave them shelter. Then the whispers started about the ledgers. The townspeople who had mocked Ida now watched her with a new, uncertain respect. They saw her walking to the store, Dust trotting faithfully by her side, and they no longer saw a fool. They saw a woman who had unearthed a secret they had all tacitly agreed to bury. The chorus of laughter turned to a chorus of murmurs, then to a watchful silence. Silas Croft felt the change immediately. Men who had once sought his favor now avoided his gaze. Business partners became scarce. The power he had wielded through wealth and intimidation began to evaporate, replaced by the silent, collective judgment of the community. No charges were filed. The crime was a decade old, the witnesses gone, the proof circumstantial. But justice came in another form. Croft was not ruined financially, but his name was. He was humbled, not by a court of law, but by the quiet court of public memory, and reawakened by one woman and a box of old books. People began to leave things on the temple steps. A woman left a jar of apple butter. A farmer left a sack of potatoes. A carpenter, hearing the roof leaked, left a small stack of new shingles and a bag of nails. They were small gestures, offerings of apology and respect. Ida Whitcomb was no longer the town outcast. She had become the town's conscience. The last light of a late autumn afternoon spilled across the valley, turning the dry grass to gold. The air was crisp and clean. Ida sat on the steps of the temple, her hands resting on her knees. The building behind her was no longer a place of dread. The windows were clean, the porch was swept, and the roof was patched with a quilt of mismatched but solid shingles. Beside the porch, a small patch of earth had been cleared and turned, ready for a spring garden. The stray dog, Dust, lay at her feet, his head on his paws, breathing the slow, even breaths of a creature at peace. The temple was quiet, but it was a living quiet now, the silence of sanctuary, not of a tomb. Albert Pike walked up the path, his footsteps soft on the dirt. He stopped before the steps, holding his hat in his hands. He had been a steady presence in the weeks since the discovery, helping her translate parts of the letters, bringing her news from town, offering the simple gift of his quiet company. "It's starting to look like a home," he said, his gaze taking in the repaired roof and the clean-swept yard. Ida nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "It's a peaceful place," she said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the western ridge. The town of Prosperity Wells was a distant smudge in the twilight, its lights just beginning to flicker on. "The last of the letters," Albert said softly. "I finished translating them. The children from the cellar, they made it out. The journal writer, a man named Lee, got them away through a tunnel that led to the creek. The letters were from them, sent to a cousin in San Francisco, telling him they were safe." A weight Ida hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. The story finally had its end. Not a happy one, but a complete one. The ghosts were finally at rest. "What will you do now?" Albert asked. "The town council has offered to buy the property back from you, for a fair price this time." Ida looked out at the vast, open land before her. She thought of the $4, the mocking laughter, the cold night on the porch. She thought of the neat rows of shoes, the jars of medicine, the heavy, truth-filled ledgers. She had bought a building, but she had found a purpose. She had uncovered a crime, but she had restored a memory. Her gaze fell upon the sturdy, repaired walls of the temple, a place built by hopeful hands, sealed by guilty ones, and reopened by her own. Albert waited, watching her face in the gloaming. "They built a temple," Ida said, her voice quiet but clear in the still air. "I suppose I just kept it from becoming a tomb." She would stay. This place was more than property. It was a trust she had earned. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Ida's journey. Her story reminds us that true value often lies in the courage to look closer at the things a world has chosen to discard. If you were moved by her quiet determination, please consider leaving a like and a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and the remarkable people who uncover it. We'll see you in the next story.